You're listening to Barbell Logic,
the podcast where we talk about what it means to experience strength
and how you can use simple, hard, and effective strategies in training and nutrition to improve your life.
It starts with meeting you where you are right now and finding lasting solutions.
Welcome to the show. You're listening to the Barbell Logic podcast. I'm your host, Matt Reynolds. This is another episode of the Coaching Success Series. Happy Friday to you. And I want to dive into something today that I've been thinking a lot about over the last few weeks. And it is, you've probably heard this before, it's the concept of when one teaches to learn. And this is a quote from Robert Heinlein. Admittedly, I have never read him, as sci-fi is not my thing, but that's a pretty famous quote. And I was thinking about this because I believe that true learning and growing as a coach requires actual technique coaching with some real-time pressure. And really, this applies to almost anything in life. I think that true learning and growing in anything requires some real-time teaching and some pressure and having to say it or teach it to somebody else in real time. And so I started thinking about my process of learning. I'd listened to a few podcasts this week that really kind of touch on this, and it got me thinking. I actually paused the podcast and started making notes. And I thought this will make a good podcast for us. And I have found that I often learn best during the actual process of verbally teaching, not the preparation of the teaching, but the actual act of teaching itself. Like while doing so, I'm learning something that I had never learned before. So here is maybe something I've never said on the podcast for hundreds of podcasts. One of the reasons we did the podcast, and I recognize one of the reasons that I've done this podcast, is that as I teach it to you all, I learn it that much better for myself. And so walking through, even in those early years with Scott, the logical, systematic progression of strength training, it really solidified that philosophy of strength training and simple, hard, effective, and voluntary hardship and all those things became solidified in my brain because I was able to really sort of codify the lesson and then teach it to you all. And so I want to walk through, for me, my process of learning. Yours may not be exactly the same. For some people, I know, for example, like Nick Solin, who's helping me write my book, my guess is that his process of learning comes when he writes. But that same kind of pressure applies when you write a thing. And for him, he writes a ton of articles and ebooks. And of course, like the book that we're writing for Forbes, he has to codify his thoughts and tighten them up and make them efficient and then publish them for people to read. And so the pressure of doing that really helps you learn the thing you're talking about. So this has actually been a really refining process for me as I've written the book Undoing Urgency, because I had all these thoughts. I felt like they were fairly well organized. But as we really started putting the outline of the book together and then writing the book and working through the book, I realized that they were less organized than I thought they were. I could see that they were connected. The ribbon that sort of bound all those things together was there, but the very clean, systematic, logical progression and organization of the thought processes of undoing urgency and minimum effective dose and things like that, not just for strength training, but just in life in general, like the 30,000 foot view of those things needed to be better organized. And that didn't occur until I wrote it. Now, writing for me is significantly more difficult than speaking. And because I'm a verbal processor, I think it works better when I verbalize it. By the way, one of the things we do, and one of the things I'm going to do as soon as I'm done recording this podcast, is I'm going to walk through the chapter that we're working on now verbally, recording that and sending it to Nick. So I'm going to walk through the chapter. We're going to walk through the major lessons and the takeaways, what the action items are, the thesis of the chapter, all those things. I'm going to speak that. And we've already kind of talked about it. It's laid out on an outline. We have the resources and the references that we're pulling from. But until I speak it, it really doesn't codify well in my brain. And so, yes, first off, while I often prepare before I teach or before I do a podcast, or certainly before I give a speech at a big event or a seminar or whatever, and even before verbalizing it to others, it often isn't crystal clear in a cohesive, logical, systematic progression for me. But then speaking it out loud does that for me. So it takes all these thoughts that I have and it puts them in logical, systematic formation. And then the next time I speak about that thing, it gets further refined and further tight. And so if you follow me for a long time, you can kind of hear certainly a value. I'm a value driven guy. We're certainly a value driven business. We speak about those values. We speak about not just how Barbell Logic online coaching is better, but how it's totally different than really anything else out there. And the more you hear me talk about it, for those of you who have listened to this for a long time, you'll see the little tweaks and the places where it gets a little tighter. And I'm refining that in my own brain. There is a process for how I learn and how I teach. And this is what it looks like for me. So number one, I dive deep into the thing that interests me. Like I go way down the rabbit hole. I study the thing. I'm on the internet. Maybe it starts on Wikipedia, which certainly isn't deep down the rabbit hole and is not always right. It could be anything. I mean, like I think I've said this on the podcast before. Sometimes I'm watching a movie or a TV show and there's an actor that is interesting to me for whatever reason, or I recognize them from something in the past, and I look them up on imdb.com and see what else they've been in. And then the next thing I know, I'm reading the biography of the person, and just at least on Wikipedia, not literally a full book biography, although sometimes it turns into that, right? And so, I remember doing this like with Rockefeller and kind of the guys that Carnegie and JP Morgan and people that came up out of the Industrial Revolution, and it was very interesting to me. And so I started reading about those guys. The next thing I knew, I was reading all of their biographies, and those biographies are incredible. And so anyway, I deep dive into the things that interest me. It's one of the things that I think for those of us who are in a never-ending pursuit of knowledge that will help kind of set us apart is that we're just so interested in things. And for some of you that may be really focused on one topic, it may be like strength coaching or nutrition or anything. For me, I certainly have those things that are, I'm probably considered an expert in the world with things like strength coaching or even startups or young business ownership or whatever that thing is. But there's tons of other stuff I just get interested about and read. And so I read and I read some more and I read some more and I deep dive down the rabbit hole. And then even as I'm reading, I often start to write about it, often to myself. And it's often just bullet points in my notepad in my phone that sort of lead to the next step in the progression of knowledge or learning the topic at hand. And so as I'm reading about the thing, I'm often making little notes to myself in my phone. So step one is to acquire the knowledge and read as much as you can and do the deep dive. Step two is to start to put some of the major thoughts and major points and theses into bullet points on my notepad. And then I'll stop reading and I'll often just spend a little time with those bullet points, just literally looking at the notepad on my phone, and I'll begin to try to put them in order. And part of this is because I'm very high on the orderly scale. If you've heard Jordan Peterson or people talk, I'm like, I want order, I need order, I like order, I live an orderly life. Chaos is probably my number one pet peeve. It's the number one thing I see in people that I think could be improved. And that doesn't mean that it is the number one thing that should be improved. It's the number one thing I often see first. And so when somebody lives a chaotic life, they're late all the time, screaming kids, they're in their house and the TV's on and the somebody's playing music and everything's loud and there's dogs barking and there's kids crying. I don't know if I've ever talked about this. I'm a huge fan of lamps. I've noticed when I go to young people's homes, often all the overhead lights are on and it's very bright. And it's like they go and they get what was the equivalent of a 100-watt light when I was younger. I don't know what they are now with the LEDs. It's just bright and loud. And it's like sensory overload. It's chaos. Because I'm orderly, I start to take those bullet points and I put them in order. And I chew on it for a while, right? It never quite comes together, though, until I speak it. And then while I speak it, and it must be under some level of pressure to do that because it doesn't work as well, I've noticed, if I speak it out loud to myself, though certainly for very important speeches or sermons or things like that, I definitely do that. I stand in my room by myself and I time it and I speak it and I walk through the bullet points. It's very rare that I would use a manuscript of some sort. I mean, even now, like doing these podcasts, it's just a series of bullet points, right? So again, I acquire the knowledge, I read, I put it in some note form, some bullet points, and I spend some time with the bullet points and I try to put them in order, like just logical, systematic progression order. That'll get me like 90% of the way there. there's something kind of missing. I'm like, yeah, there's a step missing here, or maybe there's a couple bullet points that need to be flip-flopped or something. And then I start to speak it. And hopefully I have an opportunity to speak it with some pressure, but less pressure. So maybe I walk through that topic with a friend, with a coworker, with even my wife or my kids, remember my family, remember my church, something, whatever the thing is, I speak it hopefully with a little less pressure. And that starts to put things in a little better order for me. And then I have an opportunity often to then speak it to a larger crowd or with more pressure or whatever that thing is. As I do that, as I'm speaking it, as I'm teaching it, my mind is always about 2 steps ahead. It's not 10 steps ahead, right? I know I'm a fairly intelligent person, but I was never a great chess player. Where games that you have to think 12 steps ahead, I'm actually not great at. I'm much better thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead. I sort of put it in order, and it sort of feels chaotic if I'm 10 steps ahead because there's all those different ways it could go. So as I speak it and as I teach it, I'm often 2 steps ahead or so, putting it all together in my brain, figuring it out, making it make more sense and putting it in logical order in my brain, knowing that it's coming up in, 60 seconds or 90 seconds of the talk that I'm giving. And then each time I speak about that subject or teach it, again, it gets tighter and tighter as my thought process further refines the communication to something that is clear and cohesive and tight. So even something like this, it's been a little bit rambly. It's the first time I've ever talked about it. And as I talk about it more and I speak about how when one teaches to learn and what that looks like for me, that should tighten up a little bit more. And I get a little better, a little more tighter and figure out the process of even walking through that. And so the goal here, I think the actionable item for you this week is to think about how do you learn and how do you teach and how do you bridge the gap between learning and teaching. The takeaway here is that I don't believe you can truly become an expert coach without actually coaching, or an expert on anything without actually doing the thing and teaching, so for coaching, be it in person, in real time, or via technique breakdown, via the pressure of a screen recording to be able to effectively and concisely communicate how to get your lifter to do what you want them to do via likely speaking it to them, right? And this is one of the things that probably the thing I love most about Turnkey Coach is that it's got that integrated screen recorder so that when you turn the screen recorder on, it brings a level of pressure to perform while being recorded. So you have to provide a high quality deliverable to the client. So it's certainly theoretically easier to watch right? Not necessarily simpler, but it's theoretically easier to watch a video 5 times that they send you on squat. Watch their squat video 5 times. Think through all the cues that your client needs to follow and then type out your response. But one, that's incredibly inefficient from a time perspective. And I would even argue that you learn it much better and much deeper when you do it in real time and you have the pressure to perform. So this doesn't mean that you can't occasionally pause the video and watch a rep again or think through it on occasion if you need to, especially kind of the deeper things that are maybe going in a direction you've never gone before. But overall, the integrated screen recorder on Turnkey Coach gives us scores of opportunities every single day to perform in real time with some pressure at a high level with a much higher quantity than you could ever get in person. Again, it's one of the things I love about Turnkey Coach is that coaches can coach 30, 40, 50, 60 clients. You could never do that in person, certainly not one-on-one. And if you're in group training, you can't provide the same level of coaching that you do one-on-one. And so Turnkey Coach solves all those problems. Again, not meant to be a commercial for Turnkey Coach, but it's how we think. It's how we apply a lot of these core values, a lot of the things we've learned to in the trenches, practical granularity, like what does it actually look like on a day-to-day basis and how does it work? And so one, I hope you get to take away a little bit. You can see into my brain some about how I learn and how I turn that into teaching, reading, taking the bullet point notes, putting it together in order in kind of chronological, systematic order, and then speaking it. Now, for some of you, you may do the same thing, but then you may actually write it. And for the most part, those are really going to be the only two ways that you're going to be able to teach. It's via written or via spoken, right? I guess on some level, there could be some version of kind of graphic design, and maybe it's, you're just purely visual. That'd be difficult and rare. For most of us, we're either going to have to speak it to really teach it, or we're going to have to write it to really teach it. For me, I like to speak it. Certainly writing it is a refining process for me as well, and more difficult as I'm learning as I'm writing the book. But I will leverage my strengths in speaking it even as I'm writing the book. I speak it first, let Nick help put it into manuscript form, and then we start working through the edits on the manuscript. So that's how I learn and then bridge the gap to teach. And then how I really solidify and codify it in my brain is by actually teaching. And I would argue that that is almost always the effect for just about everyone out there, that when one teaches, to learn. And that's great, because the person that you teach gets to learn the wisdom from you, but you also get to really refine the wisdom or the topic or the subject matter that you've learned as you teach it. And the more you teach it, the more refined it gets, and the tighter it gets, the more codified in your brain it gets, and you become the expert at some point, right? So that is how we do it. So there you go. When one teaches, to learn. This has been another episode of the Coaching Success Series on the Barbell Logic podcast. As always, it is a huge benefit to us if you can give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Tell a friend or family member about it, or business acquaintance. I hope you guys have a great week, and I'll see you next Friday.